It's a pleasure to rise and speak in support of the Securities, Trustees and Statutory Supervisors Bill. ACT will be supporting this bill, and like many in this House, ACT is very concerned about the massive losses that have been caused through the collapse of some 40 finance companies, losses of some $4 to $5 million, currently either lost or tied up in moratoriums. And so those losses have had a huge impact on the lives of many New Zealanders. I want to come shortly to make some brief comments on Leanne Dalziel's contribution this evening, but before I do, I'd like to congratulate the Honourable Leanne Dalziel on the launch of her private members bill last Friday that Kevin Haig's just referred to. I had the pleasure of attending with Leanne at a meeting of the Hawke's Bay Frozen Funds Group where her bill was launched. I understand with the full support of the Maori and Green parties, and so I was able to tell the assembled group that I would certainly be supporting that bill for its first reading, and all it would require is a further 2 of my remaining 4 colleagues to also do, and that would ensure that it at least reached the Select Committee. Sir, Leanne Dalziel expressed her opposition to the proposed submission closing date or the report back date of the 30th of June. And like the Honourable Leanne Dalziel, I was also surprised and in fact shocked to find out that a bill that is important and as complex as this is required to have its submissions heard, debated and reported back to the House in just over 3 months. And I'm pleased to say that I understand the Government is now prepared to allow the full 6-month submission on this bill. However, sir, I was also interested in Leanne Dalziel's comments about the beefing up of the Securities Commission and the greater role that ASIC played in Australia, the Australian regulator. And what I thought was particularly ironic was that the Honourable Leanne Dalziel referred to the fact of introducing legislation to the House some just 3 days before Bridgecorp collapsed. And the irony of that, sir, of course, is that ASIC ruled in Australia to prohibit Bridgecorp from raising money in Australia. Prohibit. And, sir, if our own Securities Commission, which at that time had been under Leanne Dalziel's stewardship, was certainly reported, was her responsibility as Commerce Minister, if our own Securities Commission had shown as much interest and as much teeth as ASIC, it's quite likely that the large sums of money lost in Bridgecorp may well not have been lost, or certainly lost to the significance that they were. So this bill establishes a licensing regime for trustees and statutory managers. And the role of a trustee is to monitor the issuers of securities. And of course, issuers of securities are finance companies. Finance companies raise money from the public. They issue bonds and they take security over the properties, over the assets of people that they lend that money to. And so the role of a trustee is to monitor the activities of a finance company and to ensure that that finance company reports accurately to its bondholders, to the people who have lent money to that finance company, so that finance company can in turn then lend on to the people that would like to borrow from it. And so typically, I think most New Zealanders would understand the concept of perhaps a first mortgage, a second mortgage or a third mortgage. Typically when we look to buy our first home or any home, we would go to a bank for a first mortgage. And that means that the bank would lend us the money or lend us some of the money to help us purchase that home, and the bank would then take a first mortgage. And so when we come to sell that home, sir, the first mortgagee, the bank, is the first party that has to be paid off in the case when that house is sold. Now, sometimes, of course, raising money on first mortgage is not sufficient to enable the purchase of a house, and some people need a second mortgage. And so in that instance, sir, if the house is sold, the first charge, the first party to get the proceeds from the sale of that house is the first mortgagee, and then followed by the second mortgagee. And of course, in some rare cases, a person who's borrowing money may even look to go as far as a third mortgage. You'd actually have 3 people you owed money for. Now, sir, I'd like to bring to the House's attention one particular finance company that raised money on second mortgage. But, sir, those second mortgages, or at least some of them, were structured so that they were in 2 parts. If you like, sir, they had a top part and they had a bottom part. And so while it may well have been a second mortgage, the terms of that second mortgage were such that when the asset that was to be sold and those funds were to be repaid back, the people who lent on the top part of that second mortgage were paid in full. And they were paid in full, sir, before the people who were lending money on the bottom half of the second mortgage. And so the effect of that transaction, sir, was that the people who had lent money or were secured through the bottom half of the second mortgage were effectively lending money on third mortgage. So let me give you an example, Mr. Speaker. Imagine someone borrowing $100 million. They borrow $30 million on first mortgage, and they borrow $70 million on second mortgage. Now, ordinarily, if it was a standard second mortgage, when it came time to sell that asset, sir, the first mortgagee would be paid off in full. They would get the full $30 million. And then the second mortgagee would get the next $70 million. Or if there was a shortfall, sir, let's imagine, Mr. Speaker, sir, that they only managed to raise $35 million. In that instance, the $35 million that came in, sir, would be spread over equally at 50 cents in the dollar, all the people who had part of that second mortgage. Imagine, sir, if instead of that being a standard second mortgage, that second mortgage was arranged in such a way that it was in two parts, and the top part had priority for $30 million, and the bottom part had priority for $40 million. So when it came to sell that asset, sir, and let's say that asset sold for $65 million, the first mortgagee would get the $30 million. The people who had the top half of the second mortgage would get paid in full, the next $30 million, and the people who remained at the bottom, sir, would get the last $5 million. Even though they were owed $40 million, they would get $5 million. Now, sir, that may seem a rather academic example, but the tragedy, sir, that is substantially what happened in the case of a loan from Strategic Finance to the Hilton Denarau project. And, sir, I tabled a letter in this House last week where I acknowledged in a letter to the Minister of Justice that I knew Mr Neville Mann, I'd known him for many years, who actually borrowed money under those terms. But the tragedy of the situation, and the thing that concerns me, Mr Speaker, is that when Strategic Finance, a company that went into receivership just 10 days ago, prepared its 2008 accounts, rather than showing mortgages that were in substance first, second and third, they only showed mortgages that were first mortgages and second mortgages. And so when the 2008 accounts were prepared, they showed first and second mortgages. A year later, when they did their accounts to the 30th of June, they now showed for the first time what they called a second mortgage with subordinated position. A second mortgage with subordinated position, which they defined to be a second mortgage where the company participates with other lenders and investors, but the company's position is subordinated. So what happens is Strategic Finance lends the money on second mortgage. They get a group of that money from people who are outside the normal bondholders of Strategic Finance, and those people take precedence. And, sir, in my view, that the accounts that were presented by Strategic Finance for the 30th of June 2008 were misleading at the time. I believe the people who voted on the moratorium may well have been misled. And so that was a situation that was not corrected until the 30th of June accounts were prepared, and Strategic went back and told people retrospectively, 15 months after the end of that financial year, after they had voted on the moratorium, the true facts. And, Mr Speaker, I wrote to the Minister of Justice, Mr Simon Power. The letter was dated the 14th of December. In actual fact, it was written on the 16th, but nevertheless it was dated the 14th of December in error. And I asked Mr Power to appoint a statutory manager. I asked the government to take control of this company. I asked the company to no longer allow the intransparent nature of the transactions. I was concerned about conflicts of interest. I received a letter from Mr Power, the Honourable Mr Power, on the 25th of January saying he had referred it to the Securities Commission. And so I've confirmed with Mr Power this evening we're yet to hear from the Securities Commission. And so it's all very well to extend powers to the Securities Commission, but if those powers are not enforced, what is the role of the Securities Commission if it is not to tell the investors of Strategic Finance that money that they've got, some $68 million in mortgages, which are characterised as second mortgages, are in effect substance third-ranking securities? They may well be second mortgages in style, sir, but the substance of it is that those bondholders will not get their money In the case of Mr Mann's development, until the first mortgagee has paid $30 million, the top half of the second mortgage is paid approximately $30 million,